Professor Kravchenko, I want to first of all thank you for this invitation, which was a complete surprise for me. The process began earlier, but when I was appointed a bishop in Paris, it finally, I think, reached its culmination. I became a scholar déclassé, and to be invited to speak at a scholarly conference before my teachers, my colleagues, my friends, our donors, community leaders that were already great when I was a toddler, is a very great privilege and pleasure for me. And I thank you for this invitation. I greet all the dignitaries from the university, the provincial political leaders. In a special way, I'd like to salute Peter Savarin, who is one of those leaders who I saw as a toddler in the newspapers that my parents subscribed to, and who was so instrumental in the development of Ukrainian studies at the University of Alberta. I also like to, in a special way, mention the directors. And I think we all are aware of the unique opportunity that we can have at least four. I thought maybe Bogdan Kravchenko would be here as well, but at least four of the directors, Manoli Lupul, Frank Sis, and Zenon Kohut, and Volodymyr Kravchenko here with us. I don't know if it's going to happen again. I hope it does. I hope maybe there'll be a meeting of the five, and I hope I can be there, but I think that is not very likely. I think at a time of celebrating a 40th anniversary, we should remind ourselves of some of the context for Ukrainian studies in the modern period, which helps us understand how important the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies is in a much broader context. How much it has served for social justice, for the recognition of the dignity of people, for giving people the wings of their language, their literature, their history, their identity. Most Ukrainians in the middle of the 19th century were in Ukraine. Very few immigrants. And in the first half of the century, most of them were serfs. They didn't have freedom. They didn't have dignity. They didn't own their life. They couldn't move. They couldn't read or write. The abolition of serfdom in the Austrian Empire and then in the Russian Empire, the latter happening only in 1861, shows us how late, how long Ukrainians did not have basic human rights. We can't even imagine it today. That is why Shevchenko is so big in our legacy. Somebody that emerged from that impossible situation to paint, to write, to speak the myth, the legend of the people, to read their moral history. In the absence of institutions, in fact, with the legal prohibition of institutional life, of the very language. We remember the Valuyev Circular of 1863, which said, you know, there is no Little Russian language. There was no Little Russian language, and there can never be a Little Russian language. Followed by the Ems Ukaz of 1876, excuse me, which forbid all publishing in Ukrainian. This prohibition lasted until 1905. This is the time when the great North American universities took off. The end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th. This great institution was founded, as I understand, in 1908. At that time, Ukrainians were forbidden to use their language in print. Most Ukrainians were illiterate. The modern emergence of Ukrainian studies is not a purely academic discipline. And one of the themes pervading the subsequent century, and now century and a half, of history of Ukrainian studies is the theme of art for art's sake. Really pursuing objective research and science as it was framed in the time of a prevailing positivistic mindset, and the very immediate sense of need of being with the marginalized people, the poor, the oppressed, whose language was taken away, whose literature was negated, whose history was stolen. These are passionate words. But it is that passion that was behind the development of Ukrainian studies. Through institutions like the Shevchenko Scientific Society, created in 1863 in Galicia as a language and literature organization. Let us speak. Let us have our word. With its reorganization in 1893, having no state, no nation, no government budget, a veritable Academy of Sciences was created, with not only the humanities, literature, language, history, philology, but also the social sciences and mathematics and the natural sciences. But this was without government support. Being a third-class people in the Austrian Empire, one rung below the Poles, who were, after all, lorded over by the Austrians. The short period of Ukrainian independence at the time of World War I opened new possibilities for Ukrainian studies, which had a period of development even in the Soviet Ukrainian Republic in the 1920s. But this was soon crushed in a most brutal way, which was part of a period during which Ukraine was the most dangerous place on the globe. When the famine, the Holodomor, was perpetrated, when, with World War I, the purges, World War II, between 10 and 15 million Ukrainians were killed or lost their lives in an unnatural way. In Western Ukraine, outside of the Soviet Union, in the newly reconstituted Polis state, various efforts were conducted to foster, develop, begin again the study of one's identity, the study at all for Ukrainians. An underground university from 1921 to 25 in Lviv. The Ukrainian Free University, first in Vienna, then in Prague, later in Germany, now settled in Munich. In Lviv, Metropolitan Sheptytsky in 1928 founded the Lviv Theological Academy, which was to become a Ukrainian university, but could only do so 3 generations later. Many of our founders, those here present, were raised in a context in which these factors were a part of Ukrainian consciousness. These were the issues. These were the challenges. This was the history. And there was a hope for free study, to be yourself, to know your heritage, to speak your language, to write your poetry, to develop your own philosophy. After the cataclysms of World War II, which brought many more immigrants from Ukraine to the Western world, many people now who had educations, people who had institutional academic experience. The Ukrainian community strengthened its commitment to scholarship on Ukraine. An emigre Shevchenko Scientific Society, the Ukrainian Free Academy of Sciences, the Baum-Brooks Center for the Orthodox community, the Ukrainian Catholic University, established in 1963 by Patriarch Josyf, were all examples of this commitment. In speaking of Ukrainian studies in North America, allow me also to speak from a very personal experience. I grew up in the home of a Ukrainian studies donor. Not only a donor, but a fundraiser. My father would go house to house in Syracuse to raise money for the Ukrainian Studies Fund. I distinctly remember as a teenager when Adrian Slavotsky, now the world-famous business guru, came to our house as a Harvard law student to push the campaign for Ukrainian studies in Syracuse, New York. It was also as a teenager that I met Patriarch Josyf, and still as a teenager went to Rome to live and study with him. At a university that at that time had 11 students. We were too young not to believe what he told us. He said, "You have to work for the change. It will come. Evil will not prevail. The Soviet system will fall. You have to develop Ukrainian ecclesiastical scholarship, theology. I'm signing you up for the Lviv Arch-Eparchy." It was like becoming a seminarian for an eparchy on the moon. You couldn't go there. I was refused a visa. But in this little community, which was presided over by a man who walked out of the Bible, those of you that remember Josyf Slipyj and his visage. We had the great privilege of serving cocktails to the different scholars and professors in Ukrainian studies the world over that came to pay homage to the Patriarch. It was a school in itself. And one of the persons that I met in Rome, actually it was in St. Peter's Square through the mediation of Vasil Marcus, was Omelan Pritsak. When he was coming out of the apostolic palaces where he had just had an audience with John Paul II. Many at Harvard would say, repeat the stories of Professor Pritsak when he said, I went to communion at the Pope's Mass, and people would say, yes, Professor Pritsak had his first Holy Communion. But there I met a man that encouraged me to come to do graduate work at Harvard. I said I wanted to do a master's. He said, come. When I came, I found out there is no master's program in the humanities at Harvard. I said, I don't really know how to apply. I have a degree in biology, another in philosophy. I'm finishing a degree in theology. I have no undergraduate degree in Slavic studies. That's all right. Can you review my application? Yes, just apply. The old school of which was not concerned with the bureaucracy, but was guided by a passion for study, for teaching, for research. And so I came and visited and met with Ihor Shevchenko. Those of you who remember can imagine. The conversation ended with the words, Pане Gudziak, шкода, що ви не православний. Mr. Gudziak, it's too bad that you're not Orthodox. I emerged bewildered after a conversation with Horace Lunt, who said, you really should go to Vienna for what you're interested in. And then I met Frank Sisson, who took me under the wing and took me to lunch and started to explain the ways of this world. It was all there. Incredible standards. Pritsak, who read 60 languages and didn't think you were finished until you were approaching his standards. Ihor Shevchenko, who would say to a graduate student in his seminar, Mr. So-and-so, it wasn't actually to me because I was not old enough, but by your age, Byron was already dead. What have you accomplished? An emigre who grew up speaking Ukrainian and Russian in Warsaw at a French lyceum with studies in Prague, speaking perfect German, Nazi Prague, German-occupied Prague, perfect German and Czech, who did a second doctorate in Brussels, in French, spoke perfect Italian, who knew Greek probably better than any person on earth, if you take it from Homer to Demotiki, picking up some Turkish and Arabic along the way. The standards in Ukrainian studies were high, and the vision was broad. From the Huns to Byzantium, from literature to numismatics, from demographic studies to minute linguistic detail. I'm proud to say that I think in many of our places of study and research, people in Ukrainian studies set standards for other scholars. And the number of languages they knew, and the number of points of view that they could understand, and in the hard work that they had to put in to overcome the biases. You always had to be better if you wanted to make Ukrainian studies a part of the scholarly mainstream. During our conference, many of you who know this much better than I will detail the achievements, the books, the research projects. You will describe the study programs which embraced so many students and people, members in the community. I would like to say a few words on how Ukrainian studies in North America, Ukrainian studies in Canada, Ukrainian studies at this university have had a global impact. Volodymyr already mentioned how the histories written here in Canada by Borys Gudziak, Robert Magochi, the different publications of this institute, the project at the Jacek Center, headed by Frank Sisson, the exchanges organized at the Institute under Zenon Kohut, how they galvanized Ukrainian studies in Ukraine. I don't think Volodymyr Kravchenko would be in Edmonton if it weren't for almost 2 decades of cooperation of Edmonton with Kharkiv. Something that was supported by donors who were not scholars, but had an intuition, had a largeness of heart. Yaroslav Hrycak came to this institute, was it 89 or 90, Slavko? And read Ivan Lysiak-Rudnitsky, one of the early stars here in Edmonton, who had emerged out of a strong center, Seredovishche, in Philadelphia, whose essays on Ukrainian history have become a methodological manual for a whole generation of scholars. But it was the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies that brought Yaroslav Hrycak here, opened up this legacy to him, and he then opened it up to the rest of Ukraine. The work in folklore, the work in Ukrainian dance, the teaching of Ukrainian language and literature, something that emerges out of that sense of mission, that desire for dignity, the need for social justice. No other institution outside of Ukraine taught Ukrainian language as much as this university. How that became part and parcel of the program of multiculturalism, for which Canada can be proud. A program which can be a model for other countries at a time when the rhetoric of Trump is something that attracts millions. when the populism spurned by fear and hatred spans from the Philippines to Poland. Teaching Ukrainian language has a meaning besides the number of students that are in the classroom. This sense of mission, this dedication to real critical scholarship was something that was a source of great inspiration for scholars in Ukraine in the late 80s and after Ukrainian independence in 1991. Few were the scholars in Ukraine that had access to your publications before Perestroika. But even those received a glimmer of hope, knowing that somewhere at the end of this ideological tunnel, which in many ways was a continuation of the prohibitions of the 19th century, which was still a continuation of the serfdom, the slavery, the glimmer of hope that you can have free scholarship, that you can think freely, speak freely, that you can name things and people by their name, recognizing their God-given dignity. Those of us that had the privilege to travel to the Soviet Union and meet these scholars will never forget those images. From Yaroslav Dashkevich, I heard how in his little home in Lviv, which was not well heated, when visited by Omelian Pritsak, they both just crawled into bed, covered themselves with quilts, and kept talking. It was very romantic. It was dangerous. But Ukrainian scholarship was on a mission. Ukrainian studies had a true cause. So much in terms of methodology, so much in memory was brought or returned to Ukraine through the work of the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, through the chairs in Toronto, the professorships occupied by specialists in Ukrainian studies all over North America, through the Fulbright program, led by, among others, Marta Bohachevska. And we worked very hard. The institutes that emerged in North America were first spurned by students who in the 50s started saying we need institutionalization. Only through our presence in the establishment will our language, literature, and history gain full respect. The proposal of Omelian Pritsak in the 60s to create 3 chairs in an institute at Harvard, which happened in the late 60s and early 70s, then was followed by the initiative here. In some ways, maybe Harvard legitimized the notion that was taken to a new level in a province, in a country where Ukrainians had a profile, a presence, some political clout. At that time, the global network, the relationships were strengthened. The gradual completion of the Ukrainian Encyclopedia project in Sarcelles in the mid-80s was followed by the translation of the encyclopedia into English in Toronto. This Sarcelles is part of my pastoral mandate. I'd like to call you to save Sarcelles, those of you that know what it is, at least the archive there. Building on the burse that the Ukrainian community established in Saskatoon and Winnipeg and Edmonton. Scholars and students together established communities of Ukrainian studies, the study of language. The policy of multiculturalism created the bilingual schools which fed into the undergraduate programs, and the undergraduate programs fed into a top-notch PhD program here at the University of Alberta. I venture to say, maybe it could be an exaggeration, but 10 years ago, there was no place that had such a sophisticated community of Ukrainian historians as the University of Alberta. Scholars, the early modern period, the modern period, the Soviet period, and contemporary history, second to none. These programs, created in Canada, became a place to which PhDs from other places flocked. They found jobs at a time when the job market was very difficult. My colleagues from Harvard, Victor Ostapchuk, Maxim Tarnowski, Uliana Pasichnik, Ola Andrievska, others that I might forget, not mention, Roman Kuropetsky, all came to Canada and continued this marathon. These achievements, this sense of community mission, this sense of responsibility to the community is something that needs to be recognized and cherished. One of the most beautiful aspects of Ukrainian studies are the relationships that were developed. In 1988, I went as the only American PhD student at the time to Ukraine for a 6-month internship. And I was placed in a dormitory on Lomonosova, where already there was a colleague who I did not yet know, Bogdan Klid, resident in this dorm. I had the privilege to be a witness at his wedding. And then he and Helena took great care of me. I didn't have anything but a teapot for 6 months. We would go to the so-called milk bars, molochny bare, where everything was white and you had a sense that it could be clean, whether the milk, the cheese, or the manna kasha. How do you say that in English? Farina, yeah. And then one time, I remember it was the second anniversary of the Chernobyl disaster. I was followed from a demonstration by the KGB. And unfortunately, I had just received a few volumes of underground literature from Lviv, which I was to deliver to Moscow. And I was pretty scared. I didn't come home. I didn't come back to the dorm for a day or two. And when I finally returned, Bohdan and Helena embraced me, and Helena said, "Ми вже питали, чи не поступив якийсь американець в морг." They had been checking the morgues already to see if I had not perished somewhere. A great solidarity in a context that cannot be, and hopefully will not be, recreated again. A few years later, in 1993, already after independence, during the Second International Congress of the Association for Ukrainian Studies, a big enthusiastic celebration in Lviv, our little Institute of Church History, the cornerstone for the revival of the Theological Academy and later the Ukrainian creation of the Ukrainian Catholic University, was being held. And Frank Sisson, Ola Andriewska, and Mark Van Hagen brought me to Lviv by plane, paper plates and paper cups for this gala event hosting 300 people. These are little details of the connections, the willingness to help, to serve, to accompany, to be in solidarity. Because there was a sense of cause, there was a sense of mission. Now, not all the time, in all situations, were we on a high moral level. There was some nasty competition once in a while, bit of backbiting, some devious deeds. Maybe a anniversary is a time to forgive, to be grateful for the solidarity that we have enjoyed, but also to recognize where we did not use to the utmost the opportunities that we've had. I want to say not only I'm sorry, but thank you. In a special way to the donors. Peter and Doris Kuhl have been so generous with this university. Without them, the Sheptytsky Institute would be unthinkable. Peter and Nadia Jacek have established programs that are bringing the best of scholarship to the attention of a broader English-speaking world. The translation of the Hrushevsky Opus Magnum is only one aspect. The cooperation with historians in Lviv is touching the lives of so many young people. Jim Tamerty, who is in here with the Ukrainian Jewish Encounter and the Holodomor Research and Education Consortium, is really making waves. I already mentioned the program in Kharkiv, sponsored by the Kowalski family. Many, many other donors, many generous people. How moving it is to remember the lists at the end of the individual volumes of the Encyclopedia of Ukraine. Do you remember those in the Ukrainian version? $3, $5 from Edmonton, $15 from Shenandoah. At Harvard, the administration was floored. Never in the history of Harvard University were chairs endowed by so many donors. It was American oligarchs that endowed chairs, not the widow with her mite, not the factory worker who was semi-literate. These are the people that have stood behind us for the last decades. Today, I hope many of you will raise the questions on how to go forward. We are heirs of a great legacy. You are creators of a great legacy. We have received in this history many indications, signposts, the inspiration to work together, realizing that it's not just academic. It needs to follow the rules of the academy. It needs to be real, critical, in dialogue and in discussion. But it also needs to serve. When we remember that our Ukrainian studies makes a difference in the world, we get great energy. Today, Ukraine is in a geopolitical hotspot. There's a war in Ukraine, and today we're saluting those who are dying in this moment on the front, defending the dignity and freedom of the Western world. But the greatest war is a war of information. There's a hybrid war that is being conducted through falsification of history, of sociology, of politics. And it is only through good scholarship that becomes disseminated through students, through media, through political structures, that this hybrid war can be won. Again, today we are reminded about the crucial importance of our vocation. What a privilege it is to be here to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies of the University of Alberta. What a privilege it is to serve together. Let us go forward again. Thank you.